old and discarded at a desert coach stop. A Lakota chief took her in and gave her a family at last. The harness buckle on the near horse was cracked, clean through. I saw it before the driver did. Before he'd even climbed down to water the team at that miserable trough outside Esperanza Station. I was standing in the shade of the overhang with my nephew 2 roads, waiting on a supply rider from the agency. Coffee, salt, a bolt of canvas we'd been promised and not yet received. The July heat was the kind that bends the air above the hardpan into something almost liquid. I had been watching that crack in the buckle for a while. The way a man watches things that are none of his business, simply because watching is a habit too old to put down. The driver's name was Calhoun. I knew him from the route. A thick man, not unkind, just incurious about most things that didn't involve his horses or his schedule. He climbed down, checked the lead team's feet, spat, and looked at his watch. Then he opened the coach door. There were 3 passengers. A merchant I recognized from Tucson. A young couple, newly married, going east. And her, she came out last. She had a carpet bag that looked like it had been rained on more than once and had dried badly, every time. A gray traveling dress that had been washed so many times it had gone the color of old tin. She was not young. Would have guessed 60, or near to it. And she moved with the careful deliberateness of someone whose joints gave her pinions about every step. She looked around at Esperanza Station, at the single building with its mud brick walls and the trough and the dead cottonwood that had given up some time before any of us arrived. She looked at it all, and her face didn't change. Then Calhoun said something to her, low with his back to me. She answered. I couldn't hear the words. He shook his head, pointed back to the coach, then pointed east. She shook her head. He shrugged. The shrug of a man who has discharged his obligation and is glad to be done with it, and went to see about the buckle. She sat down on her bag in the strip of shade along the wall and folded her hands in her lap. 2 roads came and stood beside me. He was 19 that summer and thought he could read a situation by looking at it once. He said, "Trouble with her ticket?" I said, "More than that." I watched her for a while longer. The merchant and the young couple took water and got back in. Calhoun replaced the buckle. I had a spare in my kit, as it happened, which he accepted out without enthusiasm and without much thanks, and hitched the team back up. He walked once more to the woman in the gray dress. They spoke again, even shorter this time. Then he climbed to his box and the coach rolled east, and the sound of it thinned into the desert. She did not watch it go. She was already looking at her hands. I am Lakota Whitehorse. I was born in the Black Hills, and I have lived in the desert Southwest for 22 years. And I will tell you flat that a man who leaves a woman alone at Esperanza Station in July has left her to die because there was no settlement within 40 miles in any direction that a woman on foot could reach before her water ran out. The next coach would not pass for 3 days. The station kept no permanent hand. There was a barrel of water inside, and a locked storeroom, and no shade worth mentioning after noon. I walked over. I have learned, over the years, to take note of how people look at me the first time. Some go afraid. Some go still and formal. The way a person goes formal when they realize they have made an assumption and do not know what to do with it. She looked at me the way a person looks at something solid in a tilting room. Not as a red man. Not as a threat. As something that might be fixed to the earth. I said, "Where were you going?" She said, "El Paso." I said, "That coach was going to Tucson," she said after a moment. "I know." I waited. She said, "I paid for El Paso." He said El Paso did not exist anymore as a stop on his route and offered me Tucson or here, and I chose here because I couldn't afford a room in Tucson while I waited for a southbound. She paused. I'm afraid that was poor reasoning. I said, "You have people in El Paso?" She said, "I had people in El Paso." That word had. It carries all the weight that language can carry and still fits in 3 letters. Her name was Iris Connolly. She had been a school teacher in Santa Fe for many years before the school closed. and the town that funded it shrank to almost nothing. She had a son in El Paso, or had had a son, until a letter 6 months ago told her that he had died of a fever. She had been trying to get to his house, to collect whatever remained, to sell it, to decide what to do next. She was not, as near as I could tell, sure there was a next. I did not ask her all of this at once. A man who asks a tired woman to explain her whole life in one breath is not really listening. I got most of it over the course of an hour, while 2 roads brought water from the barrel. And I sat on a crate in the shade and she sat on her bag, and we talked the way people talk when they have nothing to protect. 2 roads, to his credit, did not fidget. I had 3 horses and a mule. 2 roads and I were headed back north, to the small settlement on the edge of the San Pedro that I had led for 11 years. It was not a reservation. I want to be precise about that. It was a place, 40-some people. My sister's family, 2 roads family, several Pima families who had attached to us over the years, an old Mexican sheepman named Cordero, who had nowhere else to go and was useful with animals. We grew some things. We traded some things. We were left alone because we were too small to notice and too useful to the surrounding ranchers to bother. I said to Iris Connolly, "I'm going north. You can ride with us if you want." There's a woman with us, my sister. Was a teacher herself once at the mission school at San Xavier. When we reach a town with a stage line, I will see you to it and make sure the ticket is right. She looked at me for a long time. Not calculating. She wasn't that kind of person. Thinking honestly, which is different. She said, "Why would you do that?" I said, "Because it needs doing and I'm here." She said, "That's not much of a reason," I said. "It's the reason I have." She picked up her bag and followed me to the horses. 2 roads rode ahead. He had that quality the young have, of needing to be slightly in front of things, as if arrival is the point and the traveling is just delay. I rode beside Iris Connolly on the spare horse, the bay mare I'd brought to trade and had not traded. She rode stiffly at first, as if expecting the horse to make a decision she wouldn't like. The mare was 15 years old, and the most agreeable animal I have ever owned. Within an hour, Iris had settled into the saddle like someone remembering something she had known before. The desert in July is many things. Hot, obviously. But the light at 4 in the afternoon goes amber when way lamplight goes amber, and the saguaro standed in it like old men who have stopped trying to explain themselves. I have lived in it long enough that it no longer feels like a place I am traveling through, but a place I am made of, slightly, the way a man who works leather all his life starts to smell like the shop even on his day off. She didn't talk much on the ride. I didn't push. There is a difference between silence that is grievings and silence that is restings, and she was doing the second kind. Mostly, with a little of the first mixed in at the edges. We made camp at a dry wash where I knew the sand was damp 2 feet down. 2 roads dug while I set the fire, and Iris, without being asked, took the cook gear from the mule's pack and began. I told her she didn't have to. She said she wanted to. We ate well that night. She cooked the way people cook who have cooked for a long time and stopped thinking about it. Clean, economical, nothing wasted. 2 roads ate twice. She saw him do it and said nothing. But I caught the small, pleased thing that moved across her face and was gone. After the fire had gone down, she asked me about the settlement. How many people? What we grew, I told her. She asked if there were children. I said yes, 14 of them at present count, ranging from 2 roads' little cousin Lena, who was 4, to a Pima boy named Kyler, who was 15 and convinced he was already a man, which he mostly was. She said, "Are they being taught?" I said, "What there is to teach, we teach." She said, "That's not an answer." I said, "No." She looked at the fire coals and said nothing further about it. My sister's name is Wanda Whitehorse. She had married a quiet Tohono O'odham man named Harold 20 years ago, and had 2 daughters and an opinion about everything she shared freely and without malice. She was the first one to the edge of the settlement when we rode in. 2 days later, she took in Iris Connolly with one long look, the way Wanda takes in everything, fast and total, and filed away. She said to me in Lakota, "Who is she?" I said, "A woman who needed a ride." Wanda said, "She's staying." I said, "A few days until I can get her to a stage line." Wanda said, "She's staying." Again, as if my answer was something she was politely ignoring. And then she walked over to Iris and said, in English, "You must be tired. Come inside." Iris Connolly looked at her and then looked at me, and I shrugged and she followed Wanda into the house. Two Roads said to me, "Your sister knows something," I said. "My sister always knows something," he said. "You're not going to take her to the stage line, are you?" I said. I said I would. He said, "Yes, but..." I told him to go water the horses. What I had not said, to Two Roads or to anyone, was that the settlement had been without a teacher for 3 years. The last one had been a young man from the agency, well-meaning and very committed to a specific kind of learning that my people and the Pima family somewhere between baffling and offensive. He had left eventually of his own accord, having never quite understood what the problem was. Before him there had been a woman from Yuma, who had done well for 2 years before her husband insisted she come home. The children were not ignorant. Ignorance and the absence of a schoolroom are different things, and I want to be clear about that. But they were not being taught in the way that the outside world was going to require them to know, and I was not blind to what the outside world was going to require. I had not been looking for a teacher, Sorare. I don't know what I had been doing at Esperanza Station. Exactly. Waiting on a supply rider and watching a cracked harness buckle. 3 days became a week. This is how it went. Iris Connolly ate with us. She helped Wanda with things Wanda didn't need help with, but accepted the company of. She sat with old Cordero in the evenings, and they spoke Spanish. She knew and he preferred. And they seemed to find that comfortable. She walked the settlement, quietly, not inserting herself but not pretending not to look. She watched how things worked. She asked questions that were specific rather than general, which is the kind of question that tells you a person is actually thinking. On the 5th morning, Lena, 4 years old, Wanda's niece by marriage, who attached to any new adult, with the confidence of someone who has never once been wrong about a person, climbed into Iris Connolly's lap at breakfast and stayed there. Iris sat very still for a moment. Then her arm went around the child, easy and automatic, the way a hand goes to a familiar tool. I was watching from across the room. I did not look away fast enough, and she caught me looking. She didn't say anything, neither did I. On the 7th morning she found me at the corral and said, "I don't think I should go." I said, "All right," she said. "I mean, I'd like to stay. If there's use for me here, I'm a teacher. I can see the children need one. I won't push on it, if you'd let me." I looked at the far line of the mountains. I had been thinking about this for 4 days, which is about 3.5 days longer than I needed. But I'm a careful man. I said, "The children will push back sometimes, especially Kyler," she said. "I've taught in Santa Fe for 11 years. I've handled Kyler before." I said, "We can't pay much." She said, "I have nowhere to spend much." I said, "Then yes, if you want it." She said, "I want it." And the plainness of the way she said it settled something in me that had been unsettled since Esperanza Station, since I'd watched her sit on that bag with her hands in her lap, since I'd seen the word had carry all that weight. Here is what the next year looked like. She taught mornings in the long adobe room that had been storage and that I cleared out and roofed properly with the help of Harold and Cordero and Kyler, who was annoyed to be helping and did excellent work. She taught in English and asked Wanda to come on Tuesdays to teach in Spanish, and convinced old Cordero, who had been to a mission school in Sonora 60 years ago and retained more than he let on, to help her with arithmetic. The children came. Even Kyler came. And within 3 weeks was doing work he would never have admitted he wanted to do. Lena learned to read by February. She was 5. She treated the letters like they were, personally hers, which I suppose they were. I watched all of this. It is a particular satisfaction. I want to name it correctly, not oversell it. To see the thing that was needed and the person who could provide it come together in your place, and know that you are the one who read the situation right. Not pride exactly. More like the feeling when you carrying something at the wrong angle, and you find the right grip, and the load becomes a different thing, entirely. I was not falling in love with her. I want to be honest about the sequence of things. That came later, sideways, without ceremony, the way most true things come. What was happening first was simpler. She was needed here, and she was good at the thing that was needed, and I had brought her here, and that mattered to me in a way that was just itself, not attached to anything else yet. In October, 2 men came. They were out of Tucson. Traders of the sort that dealt in things that were not quite land theft, but were adjacent to it. One was named Fitch. I don't remember the other one. They were looking to buy Cordero's 10 acres, which adjoined ours, and had the idea that acquiring Cordero's land was the first step in acquiring ours by making us uncomfortable enough to move. This is not a rare strategy. I had seen it 3 times before and dealt with it each time, and the dealing had not always been gentle. They rode in on a Tuesday afternoon when I was at the far pasture, and 2 Roads was with me. Harold was in town. The only adults in the settlement were Wanda, Cordero, and Iris. Fitch spoke to Cordero about his land. Cordero, who was 81 years old and had survived things that would have flattened a lesser man, told him no in 2 languages. Fitch told him he hadn't really heard the offer yet. Iris Connolly walked out of the schoolroom and stood between Fitch and Cordero and said, "He heard it. He said no." I am getting this second-hand from Wanda. But Wanda has never embellished a story in her life. She doesn't think embellishment is honest. So I believe the account precisely. Fitch looked at her and made a remark about what business it was of hers and suggested she go back inside. Iris said she would not be going back inside. Fitch said something ugly. I will not repeat what it was. Wanda came out then, with Harold's rifle, which she knows how to use because I taught her. She stood next to Iris without saying anything. Fitch and his man left. When I got back that evening, Wanda told me what had happened in a flat voice. The way she tells things, without drama. Darrow was at the fire smoking, looking the same as he always looked. The children were inside. Iris was at the table in the schoolroom grading slates, which she'd sit by lamplight every evening, and her hand was entirely steady when I came to the door. I said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I'm fine." "Are they going to come back?" I said. "I need to go to Tucson." She said, "Then go." I went to Tucson the next morning, and I was in the office of a lawyer named Daggett by noon, and I spent the better part of 2 days establishing, in the form of paperwork that could not be easily undone, that the White Horse settlement and the land it sat on, and the adjacent land owned by one Ramon Cordero, were not available for acquisition by any means, persuasive or otherwise, and that any further attempts would be treated as hostile trespass. Daggett was expensive and worth every cent. I came back on the 3rd day. Iris was at the corral when I rode in, because she had taken to helping 2 Roads with the evening watering, something she'd started doing in June and never stopped. She had a bucket, and the bay mare was drinking from it, and she looked at me and said, "Did it work?" I said, "It worked." She nodded. She went back to the bucket. I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to. She looked up again and said, "Tch." I said, "What you did, standing up to that man." She said he was bothering Cordero. I said, "I know." She said, "What else was I going to do?" I said, "A lot of people would have done something else." She looked at me then in a way I had not seen her look at me before. Level and clear, not asking anything, just seeing. She said, "This is my place, isn't it?" "This is where I live," I said. "Yes," she said. Then it was my business. I went inside and ate and didn't say much that evening. And I don't think anyone noticed except maybe Wanda, who notices everything, and was quiet herself. The winter was hard. Not the hardest I have known. I have known winters that tried to kill us outright, and this was not one of those. But cold enough, long enough, that the inside of a house becomes the whole world for stretches of time. And you learn things about the people you are living with that you could have gone years not learning otherwise. What I learned about Iris Connolly that winter. She slept badly. She was not going to say so, but you can hear a person moving at 3 in the morning if the house is quiet. I never mentioned it. She never mentioned it. But I started leaving the lamp in the main room turned low. Just a wick's worth of light, because I had noticed. She sat better when there was something to see. She read with the intensity of someone for whom books have been the only furniture in certain rooms of her life. She had 3 with her in the carpet bag, and had acquired 2 more by trading letters for them with a woman in Benson who ran a kind of informal lending arrangement. She read them in order, carefully, and then read them again. She had a way of being in a room that was quiet without being absent. You knew she was there. Not obtrusively, she never inserted herself, but there was a quality to it, a solidity. She was, underneath the reserve, funny, a dry kind of funny, unexpected, delivered without announcement, so that sometimes 2 or 3 seconds passed before the room understood what had happened. Lena always laughed first because Lena had no lag at all. Then 2 Rhodes, then Wanda. I was usually last, because I was usually watching Iris's face while everyone else was reacting. And by the time I looked away, I'd missed the start of the laughter. I am telling you these things because they are the actual substance of what happened. The shape of a real thing is in the small accountings. One night in January, very late, I came into the main room to bank the fire, and she was sitting at the table with her hands around a cup, and not reading, just sitting. I banked the fire. I poured myself a cup of whatever she had made. Turned out to be some kind of herb tea that Wanda had been pressing on everyone for 2 weeks. I sat down across from her, she said. I dream about my son, I said. That's not something to apologize for, she said. I wasn't going to. We sat, she said. I had a good life with him. He was a good man. He built something in El Paso, a livery and a small freight operation. He was going to bring me down eventually. We just kept. She stopped. Started again. We kept thinking there was more time. I said nothing because there was nothing to say to that. There is never more time than there is, and everyone learns this, and it doesn't help. She said, "What about you? You had a wife?" I said, "Name was Mary. She was Pima. She died 8 years ago." Iris had said, "I'm sorry." I said, "So am I." We sat some more. Outside, the wind was doing what the winter wind does in the desert, which is move with a sound like something being poured. The lamp was what it was. She said, "I think I was heading somewhere that didn't exist anymore. At Esperanza Station. I'd just run out of the kind of hope that keeps a person moving. I was sitting on that bag, and I couldn't honestly tell you why I was going to El Paso, or where I was going after, or what I thought was going to happen. I said, and now?" She looked around the room, at the banked fire, at the lamp, at the shelf where Lena's slate was propped, the one she'd written her first sentence on, which Iris had insisted we keep. She said, "Now I know why I get up in the morning. That's more than most people have." I said, "Yes." She looked at me. "That level, clear look," she said. "You gave me that," I said. "You chose it." She said, "Both are true." We did not say anything more that night. She went to bed. I put out the lamp. Something had been named that had not been named before, and named things are different things than unnamed ones. Spring came the way it comes in the desert. Not with a burst, but with a series of small permissions. The ground loosening its grip a little at a time. The children went back to learning outside in the afternoons, and Iris's teaching shifted, the way her teaching always shifted. She was not a woman who kept the same lesson twice if the students had outgrown it. She started taking them out to where Cordero's land bordered the scrubland, and having them draw what they saw, and then write what they saw, and then read to each other what they'd written. It was not the kind of teaching anyone had approved or prescribed. It was just what she thought they needed. And she was right. Kyler, who was 16 now, and had been increasingly hard to keep in the room, came up to me one afternoon in April and said, in the manner of someone who was not going to repeat himself. "She's good, that woman," I said. "Yes." He said, "You going to marry her?" I said, "That's not your business," he said, "just asking." He walked off. Two Rhodes, who had heard this from 3 feet away, said nothing, which was impressive restraint for him. I spent the rest of April thinking about what Cutler had said, the way you think about a thing you already knew, and were waiting to hear someone say. I asked her in May at the corral. I am going to tell this plainly because the plain version is the true one, and the true one is what I want. The bay mare had a cut on her near foreleg from the fence wire, not deep, but needing attention. Iris had started helping with the horses enough to be useful, genuinely useful. Not just present. She was holding the lead rope and talking quietly to the mare while I worked on the leg. I said, without looking up, "Kyler asked me in April if I was going to marry you." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "What did you tell him?" I said, "That it wasn't his business." I tied off the bandage. "It might be your business, though." I stood up and looked at her then. She was looking at me, and there was something in her face that had never been there in quite that arrangement. The reserve was still there, because that was just how she was made. But behind it, right behind it, something warm and unguarded, she said, "I think it might be." I said, "I'm not offering you something easy. I'm older. This place is small. The people who need to approve of things out here will never quite approve." She said, "I know all that." I said, "I'm a Lakota man, and you're a white woman from Santa Fe, and that is a thing that exists in the world." She said, "I know all that too, Dakota." It was the first time she had said my name, without a slight hesitation before it, like she'd been carrying it in her hand for a while and had decided to just go ahead and use it. I said, "I want to be clear about what I'm offering. I'm offering you this place, these people, this life. It's good work, good people, honest. I think you already know that." She said, "I do." I said, "And I'm offering you me, what I am and what I have, which is not nothing." She looked at me for a long quiet moment. She said, "It is not nothing, not even close to nothing." She stepped forward and put her hand against my chest, flat against it, and looked up at me, teased. And I have carried that look a long time since. It was the look of a person who has found the thing they didn't know they were looking for, and is going to be honest about it. I put my hand over hers. The mare stood between us and the afternoon, and ate whatever was growing near the fence post. We married in June, in the settlement, with Harold's cousin, who was a deacon of some loosely organized sort presiding, and Cordero weeping without embarrassment, and Lena, who was 6 by then, and had strong opinions about ceremonies, insisting on wearing a ribbon she had been saving for a significant occasion. 2 Rhodes stood beside me, and didn't say anything stupid, which I had not been certain of in advance. Wanda made food enough for twice our number, which is how Wanda expresses herself on important occasions. After, when the evening was winding down, and the children had been chased to bed, and Cordero had fallen asleep in his chair, and the fire was going low, Iris and I sat outside on the bench Harold had built along the south wall, where the last of the day's warmth stayed longest. The sky out there does what the desert skies does in June. It goes every shade of red and orange, and then a deep, clean dark, and the stars are not decoration, but the actual ceiling of the world, close and attending. She leaned against my shoulder. I put my arm around her. She said quietly, "I don't know what would have happened to me." I said, "I do." She said, "Do you regret stopping?" I said, "The buckle was cracked. I was going to see about it regardless." She said, "That is not an answer." I said, "No." She was quiet. I could feel her breathing. I said, "I have been many things in my life. Some of them good and some of them necessary, and some of them both, and some of them neither. I have led men in hard places. I have lost people I could not afford to lose. I have come to a part of my life where I was not sure what the shape of the remaining years was supposed to be." I paused. "You are what the shape is." She lifted her head and looked at me. Then she laid it back down on my shoulder and tightened her hand on my arm. And that was all. The fire had gone down to coals by then. Somewhere out in the dark, The horses were moving. Lena's ribbon was hanging on the doorpost where she'd left it for safekeeping, going still in the quiet air. I was 64 years old. My wife was asleep against my shoulder. My people were inside my walls, and they were fed and they were learning, and they were safe. A man who has been the rock, truly the rock, not in ambition but in fact, knows what it is to feel the ground steady under his own feet at last. He doesn't announce it. He just feels it. The way you feel the change in weight when a load is set down properly. When the thing you've carried finds its right place and rests. That is what I felt. I did not say it. I sat with it instead. The stars were doing what stars do, which is shine without any help from me. I let them.